Welcome to the Binmin podcast. We know that the Christian life can be hard to figure out, but we believe that everyone should know their next step for making their spiritual life more important to them. I'm Dad.
I'm Bob.
I'm Dave.
When I first became a Christian in my late 20s, I struggled, and I wanted to know as much as I could, as quickly as I could, about my new faith. But I had no idea where to begin reading. I had many things that, as I read, I just didn't understand. And I think one of the biggest challenges for me was trying to figure out how to take what I was reading and practically apply that to my life. Now, some of you may be struggling with the same things that I did. So that's why today we're going to discuss biblical knowledge. We're going to start today's episode and finish next episode talking about how to study the Bible. So let's dig in and find some practical suggestions for how to get started to begin studying, understanding, and then applying biblical truth. Dave, do you want to just start us out by overviewing the Bible itself for us?
Sure. So the Bible...
Make sure to cover everything, if you would.
Genesis, Leviticus... Philemia.
Yeah,
all right.
I'm pretty sure that's in there.
Yeah, that's one of them. Okay, so the Bible, maybe we'll just describe what it is and then we'll dive into the where, what, who, when, where, how, why, all those investigative words.
This is going to be a good one.
I didn't repeat any of those either. So the Bible is 66 books, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, written by over 40 authors across 3 different continents, 3 languages, and you know, we're talking a really broad spanning socioeconomic palette in the authors, and then even in the Bible from Old to New Testament, wide spanning difference in genre as well. It's got a really, really diverse sort of book in front of you.
Yeah.
But that's like the Wikipedia version of what the Bible is.
I like how you threw the word genre in there.
Genre.
That's the right word. We'll talk more about that later, actually.
So, Bob, how and where should we get started? Because I'll be honest with you, that's what I struggled with at the very beginning. I didn't know where to start and really how to even start reading the Bible.
Oh yeah, it's like the Bible's the thickest book on my bookshelf, right? Like where do I start?
Yeah.
So really, a good place, one of the easiest ways to start is reading through a whole book, one of those 66 books of the Bible in a focused way. So not feeling like you have to pick and choose throughout the entire Bible or read it all in one sitting. There's no way that's going to happen. So just reading through a whole book of the Bible, one of them, in a focused way, starting with like one of the Gospels. Let's say the Gospel of Mark, right? It's shorter. It's only over a dozen chapters. And then after reading a gospel where you'll see the life of Jesus, then even continue it and then in the book of Acts, which talks about how Christianity really kind of launched and started. So I would recommend that, starting with the gospel as maybe the first book that you read, and then Acts. And just each day, slowly read a few verses, like a paragraph or a section, maybe even just a chapter, or a story if you're reading the Old Testament, kind of get through a whole story. And then just try and look at it maybe over and over again, maybe reread it a couple of times. And then remember, you're not reading for speed, you're reading to understand it.
Right.
So it's okay that you don't have to rush through.
You don't actually get any stickers if you complete it, the whole Bible, in under a year.
I do, because I buy them for myself. And
that's what it was. I was wondering, because I see all those little holographic stars and I'm like, man.
I'm a star.
Man, oh man.
So that's what I would say. Start by reading in a focused way, kind of like that.
And reading it, not just focused, but repeatedly reading the same passage or verse over and over again.
Yeah. So now today, I think as you read, the question for me is the Bible a little bit different than other books? Because I'm trying to get so much out of it, and sometimes I feel like I can't do all of it at once. So as you read, here's 3 steps to investigate a passage.
Right.
It's the CIA method. So, hey, there you go.
There's a corny dad joke coming here.
So if you want to investigate a passage, use the CIA method. Good little acronym over there. CIA standing for context, interpretation, and application. So there's some other people who use this analogy. Maybe the words are a little bit different, but same idea. So today, like this episode, we're just going to cover C, and the next episode, we're going to cover I and A.
So why don't you start us out? Bob, why don't you just start us out since you brought it up? Let's talk just a little bit about what you mean by context.
Yeah. So when I'm reading context, is going to mean really two types of context. One, literary context, and two, historical context of whatever the passage is.
And literary primarily meaning something like, if I read that Christ took up his cross, or tells us to take up his cross, it's important for me as the reader to know, just functionally literarily, what is a cross.
That's right. Yeah. So I would say the summary of like literary context, which sounds like, wow, I feel like I'm in some sort of college English class. Literary context just means looking around at words.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm in these verses, I'm looking around at words. And the first thing is what you said, Dave. Like, I need to make sure that I understand the words and the terms that are being talked about. But also, I probably need to, there's probably other dynamics too. So probably the first element of literary context, looking around at words, is just making sure that I know the terms.
What it actually means.
What they mean.
Yeah.
But then also probably positionally, like, here I just read this bit of scripture. It's going to be important for me to know what precedes it, what comes after it, so that also literarily I know that I'm just not, plucking it out.
That's right.
Which we know that has been a struggle. I think historically people will pull one verse out, wait out context, and be like,
oh, it's easy to see that, like, especially even on the internet all the time. It's like, well, I'm just going to pluck this verse out and say that it applies to something else. The one example I think to me, so it's also, looking at the words around my verses. So one example I think about is, I was just reading today, 1 John, really short book of the Bible toward the end. 1 John 4:7 says, I wrote this down, everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. So without any literary context, looking around at the words around it, you can read this verse and just say, like, well, love is really the only evidence or the only test for being in a right relationship with God. If you love, you must know God.
It does fit on a bumper sticker a lot more handily.
Right? And like, that's it. And you go, well, wait a minute. No. If I just read a few verses after, in chapter 5, verse 1, it talks about how belief in Jesus is the marker for Christians. And then if I read just a few verses before, in chapter 3, verse 24, it talks about keeping the commandments, following Jesus that way. That's evidence that I'm a Christian. So, like, it's just pretty easy that if you know the verses before and the verses after, then you're going to understand the literary context of what's happening in my verses. We kind of would do that with any other book, but it's worth noting.
Yeah, sure. One other thing I'd like to bring up, especially when you talk about these shorter letters called epistles, these like 1 John.
The epistles, as you have said before, are not the wives of the apostles.
That's exactly right.
They're just
as confusing as that may be.
Yeah, it's just letters. Paul's letters, John's letters.
Yeah, but the reason I like that, and I love the fact that you use that example, is because that is just 5 chapters long, and the chapters themselves are really short.
Yeah.
So that to me was just a nice example.
Yeah, maybe that's the first book for folks to read. Yeah, read.
It's a good. Well, awesome. It's super rich. Yeah. Maybe one thing I'd want to add to sort of further the perspective though is, like, as you're doing that, recognizing too, we just talked context, like verse by verse, but also as you're evaluating the entire book, when you come into it, I think recognizing what genre it was intended to be read at is going to have a necessary. Because before we close this piece of the literary side, I mean, I don't know. It doesn't take a genius to realize, like, if I'm reading, Coldplay lyrics, that's going to be interpreted and mean different things contextually as, like, a news article.
Yeah.
That's a great
like, yes, tacitly there are words on a page right in front of you, but the intention and genre of it, I think, lend a lot of color to it. And that's important, especially as you look at the New Testament and recognize, like you said, Revelation is very...
Well, I think so for folks who have a little exposure to the Bible, you can quickly know, like, all right, the Psalms, they're poems or really songs, right? And you go, yeah, that makes total sense, right? Or you read sections of the Old Testament and you realize, oh, this is a historical narrative, saying things that happened to these people or this person at a point in time.
With a lot of detail.
But yeah, right? But like, if I was asking somebody to read Revelation with me, the book of Revelation, man, I would want them to know first, and I would need to know first, it's probably the hardest genre in the Bible.
Oh, for sure.
And I don't know if I'm pronouncing it with your French flair. Genre.
You'll get there. A little more guttural.
But like, so it is these special visions called apocalyptic literature, right? Which is like, it's looking forward these visions to real events, but in using really vivid imagery, right? There's white robes, there's lampstands, there's a dragon, and you're just going, wait a minute, I need to understand this is a unique genre so that I can read it better. So I actually have some good literary context.
That's right. Because if you read that the same way,
get it better.
If you read that the same way as you do even the Gospels, I feel like you're kind of doing yourself an implicit disservice.
Yeah, and just to kind of summarize that, I think that those 3 points were extremely good. First, figure out the meanings of the words and the verse and the passage. Then put it, as Dave said, within the context of what's before and what's after. And then, as you both indicated, let's look at the particular type of genre. So that, I think,
and
really...
all of that is literary context.
Exactly. And so that really helps us with this literary context. But you also mentioned that there is a historical context. So, Bob, why don't you just help us understand what we mean when we talk about historical context?
Yeah, so I guess if literary context is looking around at words, historical context is just looking around at history. So every book that we read, even if it's not the Bible, has a kind of placement, a point in time that it happens. So this is just the basics questions, right? You mentioned this before. Who, what, where, when. So I'm saying, okay, who wrote the book? When did they write it? Where does it take place? Okay, why or to whom was it written? For example, Paul's letters, they're talking about specific spiritual needs of first century Christians living in different first century cities and cultures. Like, for instance, Philippians, surprise, surprise, is written to Christians in the metropolis, the city of Philippi. So that's historical context. Like, when was it written? To whom was it written? Who wrote it?
If I'm looking at that, how do I deal with it if I come across something that honestly I just don't get it? I mean, I'm looking at it and I don't understand the historical context. Is there, in other words,
like if you're like, this talks about like meat being sacrificed to idols.
Exactly.
Like that's not part of my,
in 1 Corinthians 8. That's an excellent example. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's good. So historical context is those like who, what, when questions, but it also involves thinking about cultural and political and religious influences that are occurring at that time. So of course that can affect us being able to understand a passage.
Yeah. So, well,
Do you have an
okay.
example?
Oh, so glad you asked. You know, when my light bulb goes off, just stay with Revelation. Contextually, who was John writing to? He was writing to first century church that was being persecuted by Roman Emperor Domitian, right? So to know that these people were like in that context lends a different perspective entirely to the way that they're evaluating their future Messiah returning in glory. And I think that rings a bit differently than if it, had been written 800 years later.
And I think that context helps me. I'm glad you used Revelation. That helps me even in reading it, because I realize, wow, these are Christians going through persecution, and they're being given these future visions so that they can endure faithfully until they see their Savior again. So even when I read that, knowing the context, I know, okay, the point isn't for me to understand like every single detail or know the timing of every one of these things that happen. The point is to help me endure too.
Right. Which is odd because you wouldn't so much so think that from an apocalyptic book. Like you think, oh yeah, this is just poetic, right?
And it makes me think too, you're talking about Revelation. I realize Revelation may not be the first book that people want to read, and I'm probably not going to recommend that. Like, you totally can. That's great. But like, I just know what's been true in my life, and that is like, as we keep growing in our understanding, which happens like the more and more the Bible we read, the more we're going to want more of it, if that makes sense. So like,
Seems
just
right.
simply the more Bible I read, the more I'm expanding my understanding of who this like faithful covenant keeping God is in the Old Testament in particular, or who this amazing God is who would send his son Jesus in the New Testament, and that son Jesus is going to return at the end of time for us. So like, as we do this, I have this motivation where the more I read, the more I want to know, and like the more I want to get my hands on. But as you were mentioning, Dad, when we bump up against issues, there's great like study Bibles.
I'm glad you brought that
resources,
up. Yes.
like even sermons from really good gospel proclaiming like preachers, even commentaries, right? If you're kind of like me and you're kind of a Bible geek who really wants to learn all these little nuanced things, even commentaries that can help us get it better.
Yeah, and I think that for this podcast, I think that's going to be a perfect transition for us to now move into our next podcast. So we've done a really nice job, I think, of explaining so that I get it. And I hope others
You're
do
welcome.
too. Thank you. Thank you.
That's right. That's how we end every episode.
Just making sure that the old man is kept up. Really, that's
like, thank you very much.
So we've talked about the context, the literary context, the historical context. But as we end the podcast, I want to know practically, so what?
So what?
Yeah. What does and how does Bible knowledge help me? Why does it even matter?
Yeah.
So you guys want to take a shot at that?
I mean, I feel pretty strongly that like if you are a Jesus loving, reader of the word, you should want to know him better. You know him deeper through a very specific avenue, being his word. But like knowing scripture deeper and in context broadens the entire experience so that you know God better, deepens your relationship, gives you handles for this world, and so you're asking, so what? My thought is like, okay, next time you are scrolling on Twitter or Instagram or something and you see some verse pop up, like it is not uncommon for me to like be scrolling through, and see some like CrossFitter dude. It's got like, Philippians 4:13 in the bio, and you're like, man, that's awesome. But rarely do I ever think to myself, I wonder what verses come before and after. So maybe my challenge this week would be like, okay, the next time you see a verse, bumper sticker, social media, somebody mentions something, or even in a sermon at church or something online, go and do a little digging and just see what you find, right? It is not hard to go find, jump on a BibleGateway.com or something and go, oh, I didn't realize that when Paul wrote this thing or John wrote this thing, they were writing to this kind of context. Oh, I didn't know these were the 5 verses that came before and 5 after. Oh my gosh. And I think what you'll find is like, it starts broadening your appreciation as you understand context for both what was written, but also how it was intended. So
yeah, that is such a great way for us to conclude this particular podcast. And thank you guys. And this will allow us to go ahead and
again, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for listening to the Binmin podcast, where we believe everyone should know their next step for making their spiritual life more important to them. Binmin is a resource ministry dedicating to help you discover your next steps.
So please come and subscribe and like this video here on YouTube if you are so moved, and be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to the Binmin podcast. And lastly, be sure to check us out on socials, see what's coming next. We appreciate any involvement you give us in the digital realm.
Yeah, thanks for watching and listening to this kind of first part on Bible knowledge, and we'll look forward to joining you next time as we talk about continuing Bible knowledge in our next episode. God bless.